protect priceless river cane. Those 4 words are what we're going to talk about now. This is Al Fritz from earthhealing.info. We're in the middle of a patch of what's American bamboo, one of the few varieties that we have in this nation, or even in this hemisphere, of bamboo itself. And we know that it is a very priceless thing. We say protect instead of saying utilize, which was what we originally wanted to say, except that it has been overutilized. 10% of the state of Kentucky was at one time covered with this river cane, and by now it is only a fraction of 1% that's left. So protection is what we should be talking about, not utilization, even though it can be utilized because, for one thing, the animals love it. If you put an animal here in the middle of winter time, it's a green full of, both protein and carbohydrates, and the animal knows it, and it's got a sweet taste to it. They'll eat it up. And so animal feed is one of the uses, and it's the major one for why there is so little of it left. So protect is the word we want to say. We want to say priceless because we don't have other varieties in the state of Kentucky, or throughout the entire hemisphere for that matter, except what has been brought in from Asia, which has about 250 varieties. We also want to say that it's the river cane we want to talk about rather than American bamboo, because that word has been misused to include all those that have been brought from abroad. So we have all these invasive, in many types, invasive and exotic species that would come under that aegis, and we really want to talk about that which people call river cane, and it is the cane lands is what is so important. And we know in Kentucky there are not only cane ridge, cane lands, cane of everything, and so we can say that cane has been a major part, and we will go into the history of that in the next few moments. We're going to divide river cane into 3 sections: that of the history of it, that of the uses, and that of the protection that's needed today. The history, it goes back to the very early days. Of course, the Native Americans had it earlier than that, but early days of American settlement in the 18th century. And we have the very first settlers coming here and being amazed by what is called the cane breaks. That is a whole area of countryside that would be filled with the cane stalks themselves. General Levi Todd, who was a companion of Daniel Boone in his explorations of Kentucky, wrote about this river cane. Here I will take time to digress from the regular detail of facts by observing that the face of this country was, at the time I have been speaking of, delightful beyond conception. Nearly 1/2 of it's covered with cane, but between the cane breaks, spaces of open ground, as if intended by nature for fields. The ground appeared extremely fertile, and produced amazing quantities of weeds of different types, some wild grasses, wild rye, and clover. And we'll add that the areas were also known to be teeming with various types of game, including not only the bison or buffalo, but also deer of various types. And we know that geese and turkeys were very plentiful at that time also. So they were amazed, the early settlers in the 18th century, that this river cane was present. And so Filson, History of Kentucky, the first book written on it, and the first map of Kentucky, shows different spots within the state and in various places where it says fine cane, cane fields. It brings up the word cane 4 different times on that first map, showing how much this one plant impressed the people themselves. One of the earliest settlers was Robert Finley, and his son was writing about him and how he moved into the state and finally got to a place where he wanted to do some agriculture. The land purchased by my father was a part of an unbroken cane brake extending for 20 miles towards what is called the Little Mountain, now Mount Sterling, Kentucky. We had to cut out roads before we could haul the logs to build our cabins. The cane was so thick and tall that it was almost impossible for a horse or a cow to pass through it. We first cut the cane and gathered it into piles to be burned. This was performed by a cane hoe. The next thing was to plow, which was done by first cutting the cane roots with a coulter fastened to a stock of wood, which was called the blue moor. This turned no furrow, and yet it was necessary to follow it with a bar shear which turned over the soil. It was a difficult and challenging operation, but it also brought about the threatening of the cane itself. The uses include, of course, the animal feed that we've just mentioned, but it also includes human feed because when it food for we are people who need sometimes to have nourishment, and the early settlers did too. And actually, in the first year of growth, the river cane has a stalk that's very edible by human beings, and it is actually very nutritious. But there are other uses that were found very quickly, and that was we have used the flexible river cane, which is not very thick. It's up to 1/2 inch really when it's sort of fresh, and it can be hooped over, turned into a U shape, and used for greenhouse type, all-weather type of coverings for plants, and therefore it has a great use that way too. Energy, it can be used for soil conservation too, and stabilizing the banks of rivers, and that is being used more often. The only thing is, it's quite temperamental, and it doesn't always grow exactly where we want it to, and at the speed in which we want. It is a wetland type of plant, but in some of the practical uses are for cages, or for certain types of trellises, for chair canes for seats and backs of chairs. And it's also it has a tremendous use that we had to at times check the use of it in our part of the country because everybody wants to make a beanpole out of it, and it's a perfect one for it. Tapered at the top and still very strong, and being able to be tied and put into place for growing different vegetables. Another use that we wouldn't think of right offhand is for fishing poles, and this was used for years, even prior to the time of the white settlement. It can be used as a bunching when grown as a privacy barrier, putting up this between other fences and things to actually keep the people in a certain sense isolated from and not connected with their neighbor. The other uses might include making baskets. The Native Americans seem to have done this with early use of the river cane. They actually also used it for arrow shafts, and in some ways it had a certain knife type effect to it, or pointer, and was used in that sense by different people. The uses then were such that it actually threatened, especially the animal feed aspect, threatened the very life and life of the river cane itself. We must remember, and we move into the third section of protection, that bamboo, in the general, that is the 270 varieties, many of them are the fastest growing grass in the world. And they grow sometimes up to a meter or so in a matter of days. But we can confuse this, even though this is the river cane is a type, a cousin of others from other lands. It is really the American bamboo. The problem is that the society, which calls itself American Bamboo Society, really incorporates all the other varieties that are brought to this country as exotic species, some of which become really invasive if you allow them to go around because they will spread so rapidly because of the rhizomes, which is the underground root systems that bring about the spread of many of the bamboos. So this one is really, it's called Arundinaria gigantea. And this is really a type of a bamboo, but at the same time, it is very rare as far as the history of the world goes, but very much common here in the Kentucky area and some of the central United States areas. Cane is used, the word, to mean Cane Ridge, which is where the great Protestant Reform came in the turn of the 19th century, is at Cane Ridge, Kentucky. But there's Cane Creek, Cane Valley, Caneville, and all types of caney. These words have been used quite often to show the predominance of this material in parts of our state. But more or less, we're talking in this third area about protecting what is being threatened. And cane, as we brought up before, is somewhat temperamental. We go and set it, hoping that it will grow to either be some type of safety or privacy barrier, and it may not for a period of time, or then suddenly start up and grow very rapidly. And so we can't predict beforehand how quickly it can be transformed, a piece of land can be transformed into it. What we have shown in our going through the valley is that some of this will grow in areas that we have already stirred up, and one was an artificial wetlands, and on top of this was some very tall river cane that grew when it was planted there. Other places, it struggles to keep going. So it's one of those areas that we've got to show protection in that we can't just use it indiscriminately anytime we want to and expect it to continue to flourish. It may not. And therefore, we have to consider ourselves either as individuals who must protect it on the lands of which we've got, or we should consider it as a national or regional resource that deserves regulation and the protection of everyone. Especially, we consider it as a area of soil conservation, especially riverbank conservation, and consider that this is something that not only needs protection in order to start growing, but to continue to flourish in it. So this area of protection goes beyond just discovering the priceless nature of river cane, and it goes beyond that of the various uses we can make and invent for it, but we must consider it as a natural beauty, something that is what should be flourishing in our state, that always has a need to protect the native species that are already there. We're coming to a conclusion now. We can see that this is in the river, the Rockcastle River Valley, but the cane also grows on uplands, and it is very vigorous in areas which has a lot of limestone and phosphorus in the soil. And so we can really see that it can grow again if it's protected. So again, we're talking about the protection of priceless river cane. And we want to say that again because, well, 2 days before this is being shot, it was 6 degrees above zero. Can we believe that? And they have all of these leaves that look like it's, well, the same way they look in the middle of summer. But it's not truly evergreen because they could lose those leaves. But at the same time, it does hold its green fairly well, as we can see in this protected spot. But still, out in the open, in the middle of January, we do have river cane. And it's something that's priceless for us all, and we should try to protect it as much as we can. This is Al Fritz from earthhealing.info. Come back and see us sometime.